Okay, Caroline, thanks for coming along. One of these events that we'll be putting up to connected with the Review of International Studies, and we thought what we would do is something connected to COP26. There's been a number of papers over the year in the review on climate change, governance and politics, and we bundled those together into a sort of special issue, virtual special issue. And one of those papers was your paper on benchmarking, I think, from a few years ago. And so we thought we'd use this as an opportunity to sort of do that, and then also say a few things about what the argument in that article and mean about how people might think about COP26 and climate governance more generally. So I wonder if we start by, if you just want to sort of give us a sketch of what the concept of benchmarking as a form of climate governance meant in that article, and what types of things we're talking about, and why you thought that was a useful sort of concept or frame to think about climate governance.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, and thanks for having me on this. So benchmarking is interesting, and like so much of what we discuss when we talk about governance or when we talk about politics, it's complex because it looks like a simple way of measuring and thinking about how we're doing in relation to climate change governance and what we're achieving, but it's actually underneath all of that highly political. And so the article was looking at EU benchmarks, actually, and how they're used to measure performance, but in ways that it can make some countries, and the countries I looked at in the paper were the UK and Germany. It made the UK look like a really shining example of climate governance, and it made Germany look much less so. Whereas if you would read other more qualitatively informed analyses of those two countries, you would see basically diametrically opposed arguments. So this was like a really interesting starting point for me to think about benchmarking. And I guess some of the ways that I wanted to explain how this quantification ended up making the UK look so fabulous was by talking about, first of all, who sets these processes of benchmarking, who decides what goes in a benchmark, what year is decided as the year that you compare your performance against, etc., etc. And so I looked at sort of the power relations behind the construction of benchmarks. Then I also looked at the construction of benchmarks in terms of what goes in and what is left out. And one of the real interesting aspects of climate change benchmarks is that they see things like CO2 or maybe renewables, depending on the benchmark, but they don't see other things like wider environmental considerations. So Germany, of course, had chosen a path where it would get rid of nuclear for environmental reasons, but then viewed as a climate performer on CO2 measures, they looked relatively less good. So it's about what benchmarks see through oversimplifying what they don't see, basically.
Yeah, no, that's great, thanks. Yeah, I was wondering in terms of, I mean, there's loads in there. I was wondering, thinking about how that intersected with the work that I've been doing with various colleagues on ideas about transnational climate governance, and especially one of the things that struck me when the Paris Agreement came in, which I think was the same year as your article, but obviously not connected, that the design of the Paris Agreement might actually create lots of space for forms of transnational efforts by NGOs in particular, to try and do that sort of exercise of ranking activity by states and working out, precisely because the agreement doesn't do it itself. It just says the governments have to produce a bunch of plans, NDCs. So I wondered what you thought about, and you mentioned the Climate Change Policy Performance Index in there, but we've also since got things like Climate Action Tracker and one or two others. And so I wondered if you see that benchmarking activity as a way of trying to govern how states respond to climate change by other actors is that expanding because of the Paris Agreement, do you think? Is it, and what does it tell us about I mean, is it an expanded form, and is it a form of essentially sort of non-state actor authority now? Whereas in yours, obviously, it was the EU Commission itself, but there was this non-state actors.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that benchmarking is definitely expanding, and it is a definite interesting and useful tool in the hands of the transnational community and various NGOs communities. And because it's a simplification, it's easy to understand, and you can highlight and you can map it and chart it, and so it's visually quite powerful, isn't it, for those people that don't understand the complexities of what goes on in terms of climate governance. So I do see it as a really useful tool and a way of garnering attention, but I suppose I would still caution in some ways that any benchmark is only as good as the quality of the information that goes into constructing the benchmark. So if you still have big blind spots within how you construct your benchmarks, or if you still aren't looking at the scale of the changes that your emissions reduction and various policies infer, you're still oversimplifying the process, and you're still judging countries in ways that maybe aren't fair, because they're not all coming from the same starting point in relationship to emissions.
Sorry, I wondered if you thought that those, I just wanted to pick up on this idea of the sort of, if there's a connection between the sort of actors doing it and what gets left out, and is there any sort of intentionality, do you think? Do they think they deliberately privilege some things over others, or do you think it's just a effect of the benchmark as a sort of technical device?
Well, I suppose one of the examples I gave in the paper was particularly the UK as a shining example, and it still is obviously self-claiming at the moment, given the run-up to COP leadership in climate governance. But and you know, maybe they lobbied for it, I don't actually know, but 1990 is this point against which you measure your emissions reduction, just happens to be a really great time for the UK, because that's when they started their switch from coal-fired power to gas-fired power, and that is the, you know, best way really of reducing emissions in an economy. And so a large part of the UK's emissions are due to that, but it wasn't for climate reasons. It was for completely different reasons, to do with the finding of gas in the North Sea. So you pick your leaders according to your benchmarks, but you're not seeing what's gone on beneath that. And has it even been to do with climate governance?
Yes. That's I mean, and I forget what the ranking is within the CCPI, and they all have these different basket of measures, don't they, that they use to construct a sort of ranking or a benchmark of policy measures, emissions trends, a variety, you know, percentage of renewable energy, I think, is one of them.
I think they add together the predicted emissions reductions from policies that are in place, but again, you're only going on the strength of the prediction.
But you're right, and most of the countries, and this is true for both Germany and Britain in a way, but in slightly different reasons. A, that 1990 is a crucial date, and it's and B, that quite a lot of the emissions reductions happens for other reasons. Of course, at one level, the climate doesn't matter, so we can still learn from those. What they did actually drive those reductions, and obviously in the German case, it's reunification, and sort of essentially a shakeout of huge amounts of East German industry, and then of course at the international level, we've got the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, and that creates a whole set of dynamics. Why 1990 really becomes a, I mean, obviously at one level, any date you pick is arbitrary, but that particular date did have particularly strong effects in climate governance. And no, I mean, nobody chose it deliberately in order to have that effect, I don't think, but
I mean, I would like to have been a fly on the wall on the choosing of the date, though, because they chose the date quite a bit later, didn't they? I mean, 1990 was quite sort of a decade or so before when they were setting the 2020.
Well, because the UNFCCC does already in Article 4.2 A and B say give 1990 as a sort of rough start date. It's incredibly loose language in that, because it was really vague and woolly, because the Americans wouldn't commit themselves to a hard target, stabilization target. But there is that sort of path dependency. And then the previous one was, so it was 1988 for a while was the start date, because that was the date of the Toronto conference. It was the big sort of first big international politicized conference on climate. But and so they was talking about 1988 for a bit. I mean, that wouldn't have made a lot of difference really in practical terms for these dynamics. No, that's really interesting. Thanks. The The other thing, one other thing I was struck by in that article, and you said it, talked a little bit about it in your opening answer, but opening response, is this sort of relationship between depoliticization and repoliticization. And apologies for the plug, but it's a really central theme in the book that I've just came out a few weeks ago of mine called In Search of Climate Politics. But I was really struck by that partly because I've been thinking about it in really very different contexts, urban climate governance, but where you see this sort of sense of, actors wanting to make climate technical in some way, or take it out of these formal deliberative public arenas of political decision making. But usually that's to do with some sort of obscuring of the power relations involved. We really don't, and then other actors seeking to bring it back into the political arena more expressly, usually because they're trying to contest the power of some incumbent actor like oil companies or whatever. So I wondered how you saw that repoliticization, depoliticization relationship. Maybe it's slightly different to how I've just couched it. And what you think that is, and how that, maybe how that is working in benchmarking specifically, but also, do you think that's a more general dynamic, and where else might you see it?
I do see it as a more general dynamic, I guess. And like you, Matthew, this is something that I've thought about quite a lot, the politics of climate change, and what makes it political, and what politics means in relationship to climate change. And I suppose that in the article I was thinking about it because I was viewing benchmarks as politically constructed oversimplifications. And with anything that's been constructed, you can reconstruct it, hopefully as you're learning perhaps how to do things a little bit in a slightly more nuanced way. And clearly, if you have benchmarks and you have targets and you're a country and you're trying to implement them, the implementation process may throw up other political reactions to having to meet quantified targets. So, that's the sense in which I was writing about it in the paper, but I just think there's a much broader thing here that's really interesting at the moment. So on the one hand, you have, of course, huge frustrations with political actors that climate change mitigation is not happening faster, and there is a bit of a tendency there to think, well, listen to the science, look at what has been measured and quantified and set out for us, because that is what we now need to meet in terms of our targets, and that we now know why we need to meet those certain targets. And I totally get that. But by the same token, any scenario where you see targets being met, they are underpinned by the assumption that policies will drive much of the change that happens. So it's really, really hard to do that without politics, because you're talking decades here. So it's not like you can set something in stone one day and then it's going to be not politically contested for the next 20 years as you put your policies in place. And the scale of the change that is being required here is pretty immense when you think of how the global economy works today. So that some idea that the politics is going to go away, I think is la la land. So I really do think that recognizing the political implications of pursuing climate mitigation in countries, the injustices within countries, between countries, all of those kinds of things need to be recognized in order to then deal with it, to manage it a little bit better.
And to design the policies that actually might essentially create political effects that might make it easier over time rather than harder over time.
The notion of positive feedback loops in climate mitigation that some people
and coalition building and a variety of other processes that you're seeking to intentionally produce. But it seems to be also that one of the interesting things about a lot of that literature is also that and it's partly just an effect of how we write as academics, in the way that the more that it becomes a model, the more that somehow the intrinsic political quality is missed, which is that there's going to be something you can't really predict, and people are going to get really angry about something that's going to cause some reaction, right? And so I think there's that idea that you can, clearly, I think, learning from recognizing the necessity of building coalitions, of creating positive feedback so that the opposition to a policy declines over time, and the support for it increases over time type of argument makes lots of sense. But the idea that there aren't going to be any surprises, or it's not going to be unbelievably difficult for some aspects of mitigation, aviation, meat, dairy, all of the steel, cement, all of the really difficult bits that we really don't know how to do yet.
And also the question of, I suppose coming back to what you were talking about, the transnational level of climate governance, I think that is a level at which you can really start to address this problem of some Western countries looking a bit shiny at the moment in climate terms because of deindustrialization. So they've deindustrialized their economies, the manufacturing and industrial work is taking place elsewhere, the emissions are therefore being measured elsewhere, and they're looking great. So that's another really key political thorn that hasn't really been addressed yet and isn't seen in benchmarks.
I wonder then if we think about COPs specifically, since that's the prompt for us to chat. But I mean, one of the things that has struck me over the last 5 years or so, 5 to 10 years of climate, is that every COP now has its own initiative. There's the Marrakesh Dialogue, or a Marrakesh Partnership, or a Talanoa Dialogue, or whatever. And some of that seems to me, and one of the things about this year's, which seems to me certainly one that the UK government is pushing as the host, is this race to net zero. And that seems to me to be sort of intersect quite interestingly with the benchmarking logic. Since one of the logics of benchmarking is a sense to make visible, even with all of the absences as you sketched, some sort of comparative performance, with the idea that states might seek to be racing with each other or competing with each other to perform better, or at least you can elicit that sense of who's ahead, who's learned, and who's ahead, who's behind, who might be, who we might want to learn from, who we might want to see as a comparator, just like we can think of that as those of us who work in universities, you see that at the level of universities as well, the ranking stuff that we're subjected to. So I wondered if you thought about what you think about that in terms of the dynamic of a COP, when the COPs have also become essentially these business fair jamborees as much as they are formal sites of negotiation.
Yes, I mean, I don't know, it just sort of seems quite typical of the current government to brand themselves in this kind of competitive way. And it is, personally, I think that countries like the UK should be entering COP with a little bit of humility, considering some of
good luck with that
flukes that underpin the fact that if you think of it in net zero terms, and that is the term upon which they are judging the race, they can say, well, we were one of the first developed countries to have a net zero target. And never mind the fact that the policies in place currently are nowhere near meeting climate budgets, CCC budgets, or net zero, but they can sound like a leader also because of this lovely 1990 year against which we're measuring their emissions reduction. So they will look good on that oversimplified measure.
The emissions have gone down 42%. Very few countries can say that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so I mean, not surprisingly, but I don't know, maybe some people, I'm not, but maybe countries and people and organizations will be motivated by the idea of competing with one another. But if you're going into this COP and you're nowhere near looking great on that table of emissions, then you might have very good reasons for that being the case, because you have rights to develop and you have different historical responsibilities for emissions, but you're still being compared in that sort of like to like kind of way, which I think is unhelpful.
I'm sat here in one of those mill towns just outside Manchester, which was the heart of the Industrial Revolution, so where the coal really started to flow very early on. But yes, so all of that long history is definitely really important. I mean, it was just seemed to me that there's something about how, because all host governments to COPs do this right now. It's not. I mean, obviously we see our own UK, those of us who are in the UK see British politicians, and it's really common to see that it's to be a little bit parochial, risk of being parochial and think we're unique in that, but actually they all did. The interesting contrast, of course, is the French government in 2015 basically did the race by being spectacularly competent and attention to detail, and make it, did huge amounts of legwork to make their event work. One would not accuse the British government of that. of being detail oriented in that sort of way, or patient and build the relationships and make it work. But nevertheless, I think there's something about how it seems to me that, if you like, the shift of COPs into this sort of boosterism, business fair jamboree, loads and loads of announcements, loads and loads of initiatives, new partnerships, whatever, that sort of plays into the benchmarking logic, because it's got that similarly sort of, it's where states are similarly seeking to compete with each other and learn from each other and cajole each other, and to sort of, because they recognize that this, at one level, they clearly recognize that none of them is adequate. Yeah. As you show in your article, the CCPI never has the top 3 ranking places in their ranking are always blank, because nobody has an adequate policy. So sort of obviously a rhetorical device by them as well. But
yes.
Yeah.
Well, so it would be nice if they are learning from each other as they compete with one another. And I suppose in some ways that sort of competing over climate change is mirrored by the new competitions that are emerging over low carbon energy products, technologies, innovations, etc. And that's kind of interesting to me, because that race and competition suggests, in fact, that there are aspects in economic terms of moving towards a low carbon future that could be positive economically. And if you think about some of the reasons why countries have adopted energy efficiency policies or other policies that allow them to reduce their emissions, it's very often for very different reasons. So this sort of broadening out of climate change related measures. Now, of course, we could ask ourselves all sorts of questions about the quality of those measures, and the fact that we're calling them low carbon because that means you can include nuclear in it. It sort of is a side question, but it's how you brand it and the words that you use. If you use the word low carbon, you are saying nuclear is fine, and forget the environment, because actually the thing we're racing one another about at the moment is climate change, and that's the important thing.
Yeah, cool. Okay, one last thought is it's just sort of closely related to that, is to I mean, how do you see the relationship between this sort of narrow intergovernmental processes with some NGO-led transnational governance, of which benchmarking initiatives are one example, but there's lots of others, as you know, with the broader process of energy transitions? You've written loads on energy transitions over the last decade, along with lots and lots of other colleagues as well. And so I'm wondering also, when, do we get caught up in COP mania, and should we just basically forget it? Because is the real action elsewhere? And if not, what is the relationship between processes like the UNFCCC and especially its annual event, which has now become so high profile, and this much broader transformation process that we're, at least in our optimistic moments, we think is starting to be underway, but maybe we're being deluding ourselves.
Well, of course, there's a reformist, slightly technological, innovation-focused process that is definitely underway, but it's not necessarily, barring perhaps the EU, who are trying to think about injustices that will result, social injustices that will result from this kind of change in their Just Transitions Fund. But so there is a kind of transition underway, which you could label a low carbon technological innovation kind of transition. But back to COP and the relationship to that, I mean, there are moments in time when you look at governments who are having to make difficult, at the national level, decisions using the UNFCCC's work and the work of the IPCC particularly as reasons why they need to act. So depoliticizing in some senses why they need to take the decisions, and putting the responsibility for it sort of slightly elsewhere. So COP, that sort of top-down process in that sense, can be quite useful. And if you are going to have global change, I think you still do need global political agreement, even if that political agreement is incredibly hard to achieve. So, just in principle, I think that we should keep going on with COP, make it less jamboree-like, but keep going on with it.
Okay, that's a perfect place to stop. Thanks, Caroline. I hope you've enjoyed it too. And we'll stop there, and it will go up on the beta site probably quite soon, I think.
Brilliant. Thanks. It's been great chatting to you.
Likewise.
Okay.